So today we're running the first webinar for SFIO, our Solution Focus in Organizations, and this is for our Interaction Journal. And I'd like to welcome all of you who are watching and listening to this webinar. The webinar first ran back in May 2017, and it was received so well as part of our online global chapter that we decided that we would rerun it, but reduce it down to around 30 minutes. And Alan has very kindly agreed to do that. So Alan Kay.
Thank you, John. I've been working with clients using Solution Focus for nearly 20 years. And what I've come to realize is that the Solution Focus is about applications. Basically, I use, of course, the fundamental coaching model of Solution Focus in organizations. But I tend to work with groups, companies, etc., rather than individuals. So if you look at this application list here, change management, planning, marketing, customer focus, and down there in the middle, stakeholder consultation. So this case that I'm about to show is a good example of not only how do you work with a client, but with they're an association, how do you work with their stakeholders on something interesting called government policy. So stakeholder consultation tools helping media industry stakeholders find out what they really want. And what was interesting, it was what they really want from a government draft policy. And of course, who's going to go into government draft policy, especially if you're an industry stakeholder? So what we said about the webinar is that stakeholder input is increasingly important. Stakeholders often are in diverse or competing positions, and as I put it here politely, some grumpy. This lot were more than just a little grumpy. They're more likely to tell you what they don't like and stick to their position. Again, you know, it's government policy. Why would they all agree? Help them notice what's working, what they want, and listen to each other. That's where we really move forward on this project for the client, which is get diverse stakeholders to listen to each other and let them see that they've been heard and add value to the process. Don't just go across the country, as you'll see in a second, getting people's input. Add value to the process.
Alan, I mean, if I can just throw in something there from my experience, that people in competition and people resistant to whatever the changes is a really excellent use for solution focus. And can really bring people together. Yeah,
and as I put it, listen to each other.
Yeah,
they're not used to doing that. And so this client was called Canada Media Fund for fosters, promotes, develops, and finances production of Canadian content relevant to applications of all audiovisual media platforms. It used to be TV, now it's many different platforms. And they receive financial contribution from the government and from levies on the cable companies, satellite and distributors. Needless to say, they wanted to make sure their point of view was heard. Here's what the client briefed us on, and when I show a slide with the green text at the top, that's the client talking. Canada Media Fund launched a nationwide stakeholder consultation process that included travel to 14 cities over a compressed 6-week period. Process included a wide cross-section of television and new media industry stakeholders with competing and conflicting agendas and often little understanding of each other. And that quote comes from Valerie Crichton, who was the president and CEO of that organization at the time. The map just dramatizes the notion. I mean, there was the geography challenge, but the diversity of perspectives, not just within each of the client groups, but the group in Vancouver is going to be very different from the group on the other side of the country in Newfoundland. And then we also did in the Northern Territories, the Yukon and Iqaluit, and in the very far north. So great deal of diversity, languages, etc., etc. So what was the approach we used? For the design, we built a core advisory team that was staff and board. And if I remember rightly, we got a couple of the stakeholders in on that as well. We did, and I did, pre-input interviews in every city. Before we went, I called 2 or 3 of the stakeholders about what they were looking for from the sessions. And in both cases, it was simple. I just asked what's working that we don't need to change, what could be better, and suppose we're successful, what would be a good outcome.
Can I just interrupt there? That was on the current policy that is happening. Those were the questions, or was it about the workshop itself?
I think it was about, no, it was about what's working with the organization in terms of applying the funding. And in the what could be better, I would say we've got new government policy to look at. Supposing that makes things better, what would that look like? And then supposing we're successful going across the country, getting input from people, what do you see happening?
Right.
So, and it was just to change the narrative as we were going into the project, which is what you're trying to do throughout, change the narrative, and help some of the key stakeholders in each area by the interviews. Again, I wish I could tell some of those stories. The sessions were highly interactive. We would sometimes have a room of 10 people if we were lucky. That was easy to manage. But if we were in Toronto, for example, we had sometimes over 200. So highly interactive, helped the folks learn more about the policy. There were times where they had to listen because the client had to tell them, and then capture their input. The approach to the dialogue was overall value creation. Don't just go and write down what they said. Help them come to a better understanding of the policy, help them listen to each other, etc., etc. Immensely complex, big piece of legislation. So we kept it the 30,000 future. Developed a shared understanding and language, not just English and French and the language of the North, etc., but language of the technology of each area and listening to each other, understanding the language of the problems they face. So listening to each other. Here's a typical session agenda once we agreed to it. We give them all big flip charts, but before we talk about that, the client, of course, briefed the organization, the group that we were in front of. The consultation process was explained. I helped set up the discussion. We went through the policies, better understand it and clarify it. I'll talk about that in a second. And understanding your perspective on the policy, that's what we said to them. Then we want to get your input, and we work in teams and we do roundtable discussions, etc. And importantly, number 5, what you said and going forward. They needed to see that they were being listened to. So we'd open up with a roundtable, or roundtables. Again, 200 people in the room, you get each table talking about this topic: quality TV and interactive digital content made available on multiple platforms. It's a complex business. Of course, that was the mantra of the organization to help make this happen. So we asked them just to discuss what are you most pleased about in your work, and particularly in your region. Where is your industry headed? What needs to get better? What will tell you this meeting has been a success?
And did you recall that? Did you recall that outcome, or was that just to get them in the frame of the meeting?
Well, it was mostly that, John, but it was good question. Where we could, we would have some of the staff from the client organization sitting at the table and writing some notes down, because we then say to the tables, just briefly, each table, one thing you talked about. And so, again, this whole notion of them listening to each other, we didn't have many 200 people sessions. Most of them were like 20, 30. So you could get a lot of listening going early on. And then, in this early stage of the session, the grumpies got to air their views, and that was fine. You just didn't take it too seriously. So then the client would brief them. They had all received documentation ahead of time. They had all, they said, watched some of the webinars presenting the content of the draft policy, but we took them back, the client took them back through it. And all they would say is, what we want is a bit more understanding and clarification. So there wasn't going to be a lot of questions about, I don't like that, why are we doing it this way? It was, what do you mean by? And, it helped explain the complexity within the complexity. And the client said, can we please everyone here? No. Are any decisions already made? Yes, there's a few, but many are open for discussion. Some are emergent, and even there are some issues we don't even know yet. So it was to help the group understand the larger picture, and we encouraged them to ask, what does that mean? How will it work? Versus complaining. And then the next section, we're going to let you share your important perspective. The one story I want to tell briefly is in Alberta, where they're very independent. Some of the industry suppliers, I think it was mostly the broadcasters, brought their lawyers along, who immediately intervened. We do not accept blah, blah, blah. And the client was very good in saying, hang on a minute, Alan, would you help us with this bit of the process? And I'd say to them, you'll recall, to the lawyers, you'll recall at the beginning, we're only clarifying here. And then, of course, the lawyers would ignore me and carry on with their complaint. And I said, hold on a minute. So I turned to the audience and I said, we're here to clarify at this point. What's your advice to your fellow lawyers in the room? Largely the group said, shut up, sit down, listen to Alan. We want to hear more about the policy. So again, I was being a bit cheeky, but that was the whole point, was to get away from the complaining.
So it's comes out very clear that you've got to have a very clear rule on this is clarification. This is not, this is not your opportunity to object.
Yeah, and the client took them through 13 pieces of the legislation. Stopped at each one and said, okay, what questions do you have to better understand? And they did it very succinctly. It was after a couple of tries, it was amazing to watch the client reframe the conversation with the audience. The solution focused approach helped the client be more solution focused with their audiences. So yours truly gets up to explain the approach, and I say to them, the purpose of this section is your input captured. It's easy to share the problem, so what's important to share is what you want. What you want will be different perspectives. So you are going to disagree with each other, but what we want to know is what you want versus what's wrong. And as your leader said, will you get everything? Probably not. But here, look at this. We're going across the country, 18 sessions. What we're looking for is the aggregate of your ideas. And you can be both idealistic and pragmatic. There are no bad ideas. So it took a wee while for each of the groups to get into this notion, but we helped them by, first of all...
Actually, could we just go back one there? Because there was something interesting I was just looking at in your flip chart there.
Yeah.
Possible, yeah. If you just look in that bottom corner, you've got a couple of very clear kind of statements from people, but then you've got broadcasters should never have access to federal, provincial tax credits, no discussion. And that really brings out the kind of animosity towards some of this policy that you had, and some of the challenge that you had to deal with, and how solution focus can help you get through that.
Yeah, and then that specifically would have been the producers who had too much sway on where the money was spent in the past. So then they were frightened that the broadcasters were going to come in and interfere with their productions. And what I'd said to the client over and over again, and they really understood it, was take them seriously, not literally. Mm-hmm. We're going to find them writing this stuff down. But in the next town, they're probably going to have a different perspective. So we're looking for the aggregate.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
And to help them sort out what each group wanted to talk about, we did some scaling or putting importance against the different topics. And so on the left-hand side, you can see the various topics, the 13 pieces. And on the right-hand side, this is from one of those cities. They wanted to talk about English regulations, audience success, return on investment, marketing and promotion, terms of trade, docs, documentaries, and broadcast or in-house. So they got to talk about what they wanted to talk about. They couldn't talk about everything, but let's pick the things that are important to you.
And how did they do that scaling? That was on each table they decided?
Yeah, truthfully, I can't remember. I think we might have done stickies or something. But again, it's letting them have influence on the conversation, letting them see what's important to that group in that room at that time.
Right.
Again, I can assure you that in Quebec, the English regulations were of zero interest to them. So here's the flip chart. I'm going to go into the details in a second, but we did it literally flip chart size, printed up. And you can see they write the policy issue, number one column, suppose over time make progress on this policy issue, what will work versus tell us what you don't like. What needs to be better in the policy statement? Yeah, this is a chance for a little bit of therapeutic moaning, but also more purposeful. What needs to be better? And then, because there's so many stakeholders, column number 3, who's affected? And number 4, scale the importance. And if you look down the bottom right side, scaling the importance, 1, would be helpful, 2, critical to certain businesses, 3, universal need. So it again add some subtlety to the input that they gave back. Here's one that was written out, up the top left-hand corner, policy issue, write the name and clarify. We didn't want them just to write down the topic. We, said, have a conversation for a few minutes about what this means to you. And I can assure you, while I put times against them, I'm incorrectly known, politically incorrectly known by people and my clients as the time Nazi, but with a purpose, which is if you give some people some clarity about the amount of time they have to talk about something, they're likely to be more focused. And of course, we had to do this all over the country, and we weren't going to spend days and days in any one place. So point number 2, suppose over time we make progress in this key policy issue, what will be working? And I said to them, please use the language we will be making, the funding has helped us. Did they follow that exactly? No, but it influenced the way they thought about stuff. 3, what could be better in the policy statement? The government wanted to know what they'd missed or what was incorrectly stated, because they're sitting in the capital, Ottawa, not fully understanding the real nature of the business. And who's affected? We gave them different stakeholder groups there, and scale the importance.
One thing that strikes me when I look at this is this is post the fact that they've written a policy and now they want to get feedback on it. But actually, you could also, I'm not saying you would do it necessarily the only way, but you could also have done a roadshow before doing the policy and actually got people's input in a solution-focused way.
Absolutely. This was still the draft. Truthfully, I don't think the government was interested in doing a lot more work on the draft, but they did want to see where they were off base because of the vast array of different needs of the stakeholders. Yeah. So down the bottom right-hand corner there, no right answers, instead right. That's a line I use all the time. I say to folks, you're going to disagree at the table. Don't spend time on your disagreement, just write it down. But within the framework of, for example, suppose over time we make progress, so that you use the time efficiently. The more time they spend discussing their thoughts, the less time you have to get good thoughts down on paper. It's an interesting issue when you're structuring the conversation as much as you are. We don't generally do that in solution-focused coaching, but when you've got 200 people or even 10 people in the room, this seems to help them. And you remember that going across the country, you're going to get some gems from people when they think this way, as well as all the complaints. So you'll see in this slide, on the top left-hand side, they get to discuss the key policy issue. They capture their thinking. Now what's important, bottom left-hand side, they get to present their ideas to each other. That previous slide where we showed that there were 6 topics that they wanted to talk about, we'd break them up amongst the tables. Each table took a topic. Then they got up to present. And what was important was it wasn't somebody from my client group that was presenting, it was them themselves to each other. And I say to them, we could go on at length about your input. We just don't really have a lot of time, but the more important point is we want to understand the essence of what you're talking about. So they did that. And then we'd close off with a roundtable where we'd pick up some of the themes that had come up from the presentations and expand on it. You know, oh, you mentioned blah, blah, blah. Supposing that was working properly, why would that work? What does the policy need to do to make that happen? So that they, again, could hear each other talking this way. The people who came to the room thinking they were going to disagree, producers and broadcasters, etc., and instead are talking together. So there was a lot of good learning went on.
Can I just clarify again? So the round table, you select people from all the tables around, one person from each table. They come in and represent their team, as it were. And did you find that they were fairly balanced? They didn't try and just sway everything from their own individual viewpoint? They represented the team?
It was in between. You know, you still have some grumpies at the table, but look at the question that's structured there. Suppose we're successful implementing and leveraging the policy, what will be different and better?
Yeah.
You're getting them to think a bit more purposely. You know, there were some places where some of the grumpies in the room were probably never going to let hold of their position because that's just who they are. But the other people talking in this sort of language helped the rest of the room. And if you look at that picture up in the top right-hand corner there, I'm hidden in the corner there. The two people sitting beside me are my clients. And they're at the table engaging in the conversation. And then, and I think this was one of the most important pieces of the work from my perspective, and I'm speaking on behalf of the audience, Valerie, the client, would get up and say, what we heard you saying was, and she had, you know, pages of notes. You know, and she did say, are you going to get all this? No. But what you've just told us is really important, is going into the policy or considerations. Then she talked at length, how will we take your voice forward? They needed to know that it wasn't just going to disappear into a bureaucratic system. It was going to take a while. It was probably about 6 months before the final policy was announced.
So if I was to take 3 lessons from that, maybe it was from the client's point of view.
Yeah.
It was use a solution focus approach, because that's going to reduce the defensiveness in the room.
Yep.
And it's going to get people more constructive.
Yep.
Make copious notes so that they can hear that you're listening to them.
Yeah.
And then really represent their voice as they're going forward. Because the reason why I'm saying that is simply that there's lessons here for solution-focused practitioners, but there's actually some really good lessons for clients. That she seemed to have been a role model for a client, how to approach it from a client's point of view.
Truthfully, I was recommended to this client by one of their board members who'd worked with me before. The client embraced the thinking right away. The client in particular, Valerie, I describe her as a 5'0" farm girl from Saskatchewan, tough as nails. But she understood intellectually what we were trying to do, particularly that piece at the end, what we heard you saying. And we did stuff like making sure before the room emptied, the final comments, we'd gather all the flip charts and say, thank you very much for this. I feel sorry for the folks who are going to be condensing this, because we're doing this in 18 cities. You needed to let them see that the voice was going to be heard. Here's what Valerie said in concluding: without the advice, guidance, and process that was developed in the focus group sessions. I wish Valerie hadn't called it focus group, but the sessions led by Alan Kay, I don't think I get the credit, is solution focused. This could have been a recipe for disaster. Instead, what we have is understanding, if not always agreement, and I love that, and an environment of trust and knowledge on which to move forward. A month after the final document was signed by the government, they had a meeting in Toronto to announce it to the various industry stakeholders, and one of the leaders of the industry stakeholder group stood up and said, I want to thank the government for the work they've done on moving this policy forward, it's important to us. We, the industry, watered down the wine a bit to get here, but what we've got is something that we can all work with. And I think that was a profoundly important statement. Get Valerie saying, not always agreement. The industry stakeholder saying, watered down the wine. Accepting that you can't have perfection, but you've got something that's workable.
Yeah, I think there's you've taken a broad industry topic here, but from my experience working within organizations, often there's, on strategy, for example, senior leaders want to get the feedback from people lower down in the organization. Yeah. And there's always that disagreement that you get when you start to talk to people about strategy. And it's really getting over that point that actually this is an opportunity for you all to speak and be listened to, but not necessarily everything that you say is going to go into the strategy or the policy in this case. Yeah. And that's a really useful point for clients.
I agree. Strategy development should be a democratic process, but it's hard. What's important is for the leadership developing strategy to listen to the input and take it seriously, not literally when it's all about complaining, but take seriously the good input they get and make sure it's visible in the plan that comes out, that people know they had a stake in it, yeah, and that they will implement it more effectively. Any more questions about the project? Because John, I was thinking we could just talk a few minutes about how we SFIO use webinars and so on.
No, I from my point of view, I think this is just looking at my papers here. I'm just thinking that this is, what an excellent example of having to get wide scale input using solution focus, helping to bring people together, avoiding clashes, avoiding people getting entrenched in their own positions. It's a great example, and thanks very much for introducing us to it.
My pleasure. And if any of the audience of this webinar meet me and want to ask me about the session in Iqaluit in the far north, I'll talk for an hour.
Yeah, I can't wait until I meet you next.
Okay, let's just look at the Zoom webinar format which we're using. This particular one, we got 15 odd people on it, maybe more. And if you look up in the top left there, I'm not sure what I'm demonstrating, but it was a very diverse group of people, including one client of mine down in the middle there, Dushanka, and from a variety of countries. What's great about the Zoom webinars, I can moderate and interact as you and I are doing right now, but we took it a further stage. We did breakouts, which the technology allows you to do. And I suggested these topics for the breakout discussions. And there was usually there'd be groups of 3 or 4, and they, I don't think they even self-selected it, just went into groups of 4. And what impressed you about the use of solution focus? Thinking of this type of, what else would you want to do? Thinking of your own workplace or projects, what aspect might you apply? And what was great, of course, was people come up with some great ideas, and it was all captured, etc. At some point, when we've got 50 staff working on SFIO, we can take all this stuff and turn it into more useful data, if you like.
I had the opportunity to get into the chat room and focused on that, and really was a great opportunity to meet with 3 other people, a couple of whom I'd met before, but certainly one I hadn't, and just kind of get to know people, and that for me, that breakout facility is superb, quite honestly. And as you say, you can capture the discussion just as you did the round tables there. Yeah. And really it gives the opportunity for clients to actually use this technology now to do some of that information gathering that perhaps would have needed the kind of roadshow you did before.
I think what we're trying to do with the SFIO organization is, notice the word organization, where it is about solution-focused practitioners learning. This particular webinar and future ones will be more about the application amongst clients. What outcomes do they get? Because it's a fantastic approach.
So Alan, thank you very much indeed for your time. That was a really helpful and useful session. And I thank you again very much indeed. And to all those people who are watching and listening, if you're not a member of SFIO, or contributor as we call it to SFIO, then please go to sfio.org and you can see how you can help contribute to developing solution focus in organizations. Thanks very much.
Thank you.